Okay, you see, got it. Okay, and I think as president of Southwestern Indiana Historical Society, this is one of the more I think interesting meetings that we're going to have. And I do want to show Bill and Josh's book. If you guys haven't read this or seen this yet, it is a tribute to Southwestern Indiana Historical Society. And Josh, you can see I've taken plenty of notes.
Oh wow, I'm impressed.
No, when we met with Bill, I didn't want to be that guy, but I was. It's like, and I think that if you're not familiar with it, in the 1920s, Southwestern Indiana Historical Society put on a Lincoln inquiry, in which we asked members of our society to write about their memories of Lincoln's in Indiana. And Bill and Josh then took their memories and put them in this wonderful book. And I will have to say, they were to present this, ready for this, at Ford's Theater, which I thought would have been a trip to Washington, D.C. I'd have never forgotten. But because of COVID, that didn't happen. And they were to present this to our society in the past. And because of COVID, it didn't happen. So this year we were able to put it together. We tried to do everything we could to make it a live meeting, but because of situations, we couldn't do that. So Bill and Josh, both, thank you very, very much for doing a Zoom meeting. I know this is not the ideal conditions, but thank you so much. And I do want to read something real quick before I get started with this. When I got this from Bill, Bill wrote this to me: for Rob, who is the keeper of the Lincoln Inquiry alive as president of the Southwestern Indiana Historical Society, from your good friend, Bill Bartelt. And so, Bill, I can't say that enough. It brings tears to my eyes that you wrote that to me. So thank you so much. Well, Josh and Bill, thank you very much for doing this. And we are very much looking forward to your presentation. So if you would, please.
All right. So as you can see, the title tonight is Age Use Shaping the Future President, which is the title also of the book. And we want to start, let me get that, just a second here. We want to try, okay. We want to start with this man, George Honig, who lived from 1874 to 1962. You may know him as an Evansville sculptor. He actually is best known for the statues in front of the Coliseum in downtown Evansville, but he did other things around the country, and he did dozens of bronze plaques, or he called them tablets, to commemorate individuals or events that are just literally around the tri-state. He was originally a Spencer County native growing up near Rockport. And part of his education, he studied in New York. Now, he studied in the studio of this man, Harmon McNeil. McNeil was a well-known national sculptor. We know him in this area best because he did the statue of George Rogers Clark at Vincennes. But when Honig was studying in his studio, McNeil had entered a contest to make a Lincoln statue in Illinois. He did not get the contract, but he was working on this. And as he was working on it, Honig made the comment that he grew up not far from where Abraham Lincoln grew up in Indiana. And one of the students said, "Nonsense. Of course, Lincoln and his family went through Indiana on their way to Illinois, but they weren't there for more than a few days." Well, today, as 100 years ago, the Indiana Lincoln story is unknown, or not well known, maybe I should say. A lot of people don't know that he lived in Indiana from 1816 to 1830, from age 7 to age 21, or 14 years, and he was 56 when he was assassinated. So a quarter of his life was spent here in Indiana. Now, one problem, or one reason for not knowing much about that time period, is that we really don't know a lot about that time period. And most of what we know come from this man, William Herndon, who was Lincoln's law partner, who after Lincoln's death decided to collect as much information as he could about his now dead partner. He knew a lot of the Illinois topics, but he didn't know Indiana or Kentucky. So he made contacts. And then in 1865, he came to Indiana, to Spencer County, to talk to the people who remembered Lincoln and to see the sights of Lincoln's youth. Most biographers use his material as their source on the Indiana years. Many authors view Lincoln's Indiana years as inconsequential, and some of you have heard me say this before, but my standard response to this is think in your own life. Think when you were 7 and think when you were 21 and how important those years were in shaping you and making you what you are today. Obviously, there are other important influences too at different times of your life, but I think those were very important years, or as the people from Indiana like to say, they were the formative years. To some, it actually had a negative impact on Lincoln. William Herndon finally got around to writing his book in 1888. This actually was ghostwritten by Jesse Wyke, a Hoosier. But in the book, it's mentioned that Lincoln rose from a lower depth than most men, from a stagnant, putrid pool. Not real complimentary toward Indiana or the people that were here. And then we have Ward Hill Layman, who used Herndon's material, a transcript of Herndon's material, actually before Herndon got around to publishing his biography. And that biography was ghostwritten by Chauncey Black. And Chauncey Black in a letter says, "It's our duty to show the world the majesty and beauty of his character as it grew by itself and unassisted, out of unpromising soil. We must point mankind to the diamond glowing on the dunghill." Again, not very complimentary to the people of Spencer County, and the people of Spencer County 100 years ago not only were probably offended that they were called a dunghill, but also that part about that he grew unassisted, that the people of Spencer County had no impact on him whatsoever. And then you had Albert Beveridge, who was an Indiana senator, who wrote of Lincoln's neighbors. They were ignorant, rough-mannered, vividly superstitious, consumers of incredible quantities of whiskey and tobacco, and inclined to chewing, smoking, snuffing, and corn-cob pipes puffing. Their sense of modesty was embryonic. They lived in cabins that were ill-kept, dirty in the extreme, infested with vermin, and their fighting and swearing were accompanied by low-thinking, repellent living, and filthy talk. Now, that might be the kind of people you'd like to go on a hunting trip or a fishing trip with, but not the people you want to live next door to. And quite frankly, I don't think Lincoln lived next door to people like this either. And then this view is reinforced by some other literature. Edward Eggleston, in his 1871, The Hoosier Schoolmaster, associates Indiana with ignorance, poverty, hardship, and an odd dialect. Maybe we have the odd dialect, I don't know. But by 100 years ago, the people of Southwestern Indiana were not pleased about how they were being treated in the biographies of Abraham Lincoln, and decided to do something about it. Josh.
So in 1920, a small but determined group of amateur historians in Southwestern Indiana determined that they were going to shed better light on Lincoln's formative years. The Southwest Indiana Historical Society served as an umbrella organization for societies in Vanderburgh, Warwick, Spencer, Posey, Perry, Gibson, Pike, Du Bois, and occasionally Knox counties. They sought to fill in the gaps in the historical record and really reverse the negative stereotypes, or at least attempt to. The Southwest Indiana Historical Society attracted educated people that were interested in history, including, remarkably for the time anyway, women in leadership positions. Although all regional history interested them, Lincoln's Hoosier roots formed their focal point through what they called the Lincoln Inquiry, interviews with Lincoln's contemporaries and those who knew them. The Historical Society hoped their work would improve the state's image by refuting myths and errors and presenting a more balanced approach. Contributors to the Lincoln Inquiry produced biographies on families in Lincoln's Indiana neighborhood and conducted interviews with their descendants. They really excelled, in my opinion, at contextualizing Lincoln within the broader framework of his neighborhood and the Southwestern Indiana environment, not talking just about Lincoln's own narrow experience, but really contextualizing it and framing it in a bigger picture. They admitted that the witnesses who knew Lincoln and whose memory was of historical value were all dead, but many of the important secondary sources remained available. And the Indiana Lincoln Inquiry and the people of the Historical Society were uniquely positioned to do that work. The Lincoln Inquiry derived much of its importance from the society members' firsthand knowledge of Lincoln's boyhood home. Bess Ehrman grew up in Spencer County. Ida Tarbell used Anna O'Flynn's Spencer County interviews, and William Fortune interviewed local residents in 1881. The Lincoln Inquiry did a lot of their work collectively and via oral history, which was typically then presented at Historical Society meetings throughout the year. From its founding in 1920 through its end in 1939, the Historical Society met 46 times, featured 369 presentations, and produced about 217 papers. Our book, Aid to Youth, presents their most historically rigorous and significant contributions, many of them out of print and unavailable until now. And I apologize, I got ahead of myself here. Thanks. Let you look at that map for quite a while, huh? John Iglehart, a railroad lawyer, founded the Southwestern Indiana Historical Society in January 1920. Iglehart associated dominant leadership over the Historical Society, and although he was only an attorney and not a judge, many referred to him as Judge Iglehart out of respect. Eventually, leadership passed first to Thomas Day LaHunt from Cannleton, a wealthy socialite, but the two did not get along well, and following him as president was Boonville judge and state legislator Roscoe Kuiper. The fourth president was Bess Ehrman, who published some of the group's papers in 1938 in The Missing Chapter in the Life of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln Inquiry members engaged with professional historians and, in some cases, influenced the broader field of Lincoln history. Prominent Lincoln historian William Barton corresponded with Iglehart in 1922. And later that year, Iglehart corresponded with Ida Tarbell, a prominent journalist who may have been the most widely read and widely recognized historian of the time. Unlike many others, Tarbell shared the Lincoln Inquiry's perspective that Lincoln succeeded in part because of his time in Indiana, not in spite of it. In her 1924 book, In the Footsteps of the Lincolns, Tarbell praised the Lincoln Inquiry. There has been in the last few years a considerable amount of work done on the character of the men and women of the historical of the state. Particularly important from the Lincoln standpoint is that of Judge John E. Iglehart, president of the Southwestern Indiana Historical Society. Judge Iglehart's work gives us a better basis for judging the caliber of the men under whose indirect influence, at least Lincoln certainly came at this time, than we have ever had before. Perhaps the most significant interaction was with Frederick Jackson Turner. His transformative essay, presented in 1893 and published a year later, argued that the frontier shaped American democracy, independence, ingenuity, and optimism. In the process, the frontier shaped the American story and drove American history. Turner eventually landed on staff at Harvard and shaped generations of historians and public intellectuals. One notable devotee was John Iglehart, who cultivated a friendship with Turner, and the two shared their work over the years. Turner's frontier thesis attributed democracy's success to the frontier, emphasized a transitional zone in southern Indiana and the Midwest in the 1820s, and used Lincoln as an embodiment of the pioneer spirit. It did not view the frontiersmen as backward, but as a diverse class and culture.
Society was unique at the time it was created because many historical societies were only for descendants of pioneers. That wasn't the case with Southwestern. Anybody was welcome to join. And as Josh mentioned, women were very much a part of things. I think something like 60% of the 533 people who would be members of Southwestern were women, and women were officers, and they did present papers. Speaking of women who were involved, let's go again to Bess Ehrman, who kind of sets the goal for the Lincoln Inquirer when she said, many writers have written books about Abraham Lincoln, his ancestry, childhood, manhood, and political career, but little thought has been given to the environment of his youth, or to those neighbors and boyhood friends of his in Indiana, and the influence they undoubtedly had on his life and character. And it goes again to what Josh mentioned, that they wanted to put the context to Lincoln's Indiana years. Now, we have some 30 essays in the book. 18 of these essays deal with either Lincoln's Indiana neighbors, the neighborhood, or the Indiana environment. And I have a list here of some of the neighbors that are, in some cases, there is an essay on that family. In other cases, there are references, but they wanted to make sure that people knew who these neighbors were. And you see the names here of some of these people. Now, the Lincolns and their neighbors shared common backgrounds. They came from Kentucky by way of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and North Carolina. The neighbors, like the Lincolns, came from the same area of Kentucky, the Bardstown area. They came seeking opportunity. They were joined by more relatives from Kentucky who came to Indiana. And the Lincolns were very much like their neighbors in all of these factors. Now, one exception was this man, William Jones. William Jones grew up in Vincennes. His father was auditor of the Indiana Territory and secretary to William Henry Harrison, and some of the treaties with the Native Americans that Harrison made. And so he knew the early history of the Indiana Territory. And he came to Spencer County near the end of Lincoln's stay. Lincoln knew him, Lincoln worked for him, and you can just imagine the questions that Lincoln would have for this man about that early history that he knew so much about. Now, Jones also had a little different political view than most of the people living in Spencer County. And Dennis Hanks, Lincoln's cousin, actually said, I think Colonel Jones made him, Lincoln, a Whig. Well, there's a bit of a problem with that because there's not a Whig party when Lincoln lived here. That's not formed until a few years later. But I think Jones did have the views that were consistent, and he became a very important Indiana Whig. And so I think he did have an impact on Lincoln's political views. Now, some other observations. One is that Indiana and Spencer County was a developing, changing, and dynamic region from 1816 to 1830. There are some Lincoln biographers that want to keep Lincoln in that 1816 period, but it was changing. These maps, and I don't know how well you can see them, but on the left is a map of Indiana in 1816 when the Lincolns came. You can see that only about a third, the southern third of the state was organized into counties. There were about 63,000 people living in Indiana. On the right, you see a map of Indiana in 1830, when about 2/3 of the state was organized. And now you have something like 343,000 people living. So this was a great time of great change. Families moved from primitive to more comfortable housing. On the left, you see a three-sided camp, perhaps similar to what the Lincolns lived in when they first came to Indiana. Some would have you believe it was much more primitive than that, but this is probably a pretty good indication of what it might have looked like. On the right is a picture, a drawing that was made of the Lincoln cabin years later. I don't think it had the porch when the Lincolns lived there, but you can see that it's much more substantial housing and much more comfortable housing. And a community soon developed. There were stores, there were tanneries, a major industry at the time. Mills, also very important. Schools, Lincoln went to 3 schools in Indiana. And a church. Here you see the Little Pigeon Baptist Church, which was built in 1822. Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father, directed it. But you can see it's a major structure and was more or less the center of the community. We refer to the community as the Little Pigeon Creek community. This is a map prepared by the National Park Service showing you the locations of some of the neighbors and some of the commercial activities. There are some issues with it, but I really want you to look at that line that goes from the left to the right. Excuse me, this is a road, and we refer to it as the Corydon New Harmony Road. That's important because to the east, what, 50 miles is Corydon. For most of the time the Lincolns lived here, it was the state capital. To the west, the same distance, you have New Harmony, which during the time the Lincolns lived here, first you had the experiment of the Harmonists, where they had some 800 people living there, 180 buildings, a major town, and then they sold out to Robert Owen and his educational activities. Lincoln knew about New Harmony. Dennis Hank says he talked about it, but as far as we know, he never visited New Harmony. But the important thing is, and I don't know if you can see or not, up at the top where there's an arrow, the arrow coming from the east show how the Lincolns came in. You see where the Lincoln farm was located. It was on that road. The southern boundary of the farm actually was that road. So you have people going from Corydon to New Harmony, or New Harmony to Corydon, traveling that road. And no doubt Lincoln talked to these people, and there are stories how he would sit on the fence and wait for people to come around and talk to them, which his father thought was inappropriate for a young man to initiate the conversation. Now, another thing is that Southwestern Indiana had respected leaders. This is what the county looked like, what the map looked like of Southwestern Indiana in 1816. You can see that there's Posey County, Warwick County, Perry County. At one time, Warwick County included all of that when it was first created in 1813, and Evansville was the county seat for a very short period of time. But then in 1813, I think it was, Posey and Perry County were created. Actually, a little before that. Posey and Perry County were created. Warwick County was reduced. So at this time, the county seat of Warwick County was at Darlington, which is where Alcoa is today. By the way, the Lincolns, when they came to Indiana, came to Perry County, kind of up above where the P is on this map. Now, some of those people that were important here that Lincoln knew or knew about, to give you some sense that there were some people of substance. One was Daniel Grass. Daniel Grass lived at Rockport. He came to Indiana in 1803. He was a veteran of the Battle of Tippecanoe. He was a member of the Indiana Constitutional Convention in 1816, and he was a state representative. Lincoln not only knew him, but he actually boarded with him for a while before Lincoln went on the flatboat trip. So he knew him. And again, you can just imagine the questions that Lincoln had for a man like this. Another one was Ratliff Boone. Now, Ratliff Boone, during the time the Lincolns lived here, was a state representative, a state senator, a lieutenant governor, for a while was governor, and then was a U.S. congressman. And he would have traveled that road. He came to Indiana in 1809. He lived at Booneville, which was named for his father, in 1818. And so he traveled along that road from Booneville to Corydon that went by the Lincoln farm, and he would stop and make speeches along the way. And there's a good possibility that Lincoln not only heard him speak, but maybe even engaged him in conversation. Now, one more I want to talk about is Joseph Lane, who, excuse me for the cough, I think it's allergies, but it's not COVID. Lane lived farther away, and I don't know if Lincoln knew him, but he knew of him. He lived near Evansville, near Angel Mounds. He was a well-known politician who defeated Evansville's namesake Robert Evans for the state legislature in 1822, when the man was actually 20 years old, and he had to wait for a while before he was 21 and could serve. Now, there's an interesting story about Lane. Years earlier, when he was a clerk in the Warwick County office in 1818, when Spencer County and Vanderburgh County was created, and Warwick County was reduced in size, and Spencer County seat became Rockport, where Grass was. Boonville, where Ratliff Boone was, became the county seat of Warwick County, and Evansville became the county seat of Vanderburgh County, which Hugh McGarry was the entrepreneur in. But Boone knew that Lane was going to have quite a political career. So if you look at the boundary between Vanderburgh and Warwick County, and if you start up at the north end near I-64 now, you go about halfway down and you see that the Vanderburgh County line goes east about a mile and then on down to the river. Well, the reason for that was Boone was able to have that happen so that Joseph Lane would be in Vanderburgh County and would be the political opponent of McGarry and Evans rather than in Warwick County and be Boone's political. They were friends, but they realized that there also were they would get in the way of their political ambitions. Now, Lane becomes one of the most important people from this area. He was a general in the Mexican-American War. He's governor of the Oregon Territory. He's one of the first senators from Oregon. And then in 1860, he's the vice presidential candidate on the Southern Democratic ticket. Remember, we had 4 tickets in 1860, but I think it's significant that Southern Indiana had a presidential candidate and a vice presidential candidate on the ticket in 1860. By the way, Warwick County was carried by the Southern Democratic ticket because of Lane, the only county in Indiana where they got support. These men and others, lawyers that Josh will talk about in a minute, gave Lincoln his first exposure to government and to politicians. Now, another misconception is that Lincoln is portrayed as living in an isolated region with little contact with neighbors and no interaction with the rest of the country. And there may be some truth to that in 1860, but not for most of the Indiana period. And the reason that's not true is because some 17 miles from Lincoln's home flowed the Ohio River. This was the interstate highway of the day. It had a major impact on Lincoln. Lincoln actually tells us this. He told Secretary Seward when Lincoln was president that one day he took 2 travelers out to a passing river steamer. And as he pulled away, they each threw a silver $50 on the bottom of Lincoln's little boat. And Lincoln said, "I could scarcely believe my eyes. You may think it a very little thing, but it was the most important incident in my life, a most important incident in my life. I could scarcely believe that I, a poor boy, had earned $1 in less than a day. The world seemed wider and fairer before me. I was a more hopeful and confident being from that time." Now, if some historian would write this, we probably wouldn't believe it. But this is not some historian's words. These are Lincoln's words. The river really separated old America from the new. Lincoln said the Lincolns came to Indiana. It was partially on account of slavery in Kentucky, not in Indiana, but chiefly on account of the difficulty in land titles in Kentucky, where you always were unsure whether somebody was going to come up with a lawsuit against you. But in Indiana, that wasn't going to be the case. The land belonged to the government. You bought it from the government. There was a very effective land survey system. So you knew if you bought the land, you were going to keep it. Now, the river was also a source of income. He and Dennis Hanks and Squire Hall cut firewood for the fuel-hungry steamboats on the river. He worked for James Taylor at Troy, butchering hogs and operating a ferry over the Anderson River and actually doing other farm work. He got paid $6 a month, which is about 20 cents a day. But when he butchered hogs, he got paid 31 cents a day because it was hard work. Now, Troy was a major river town and sometimes forgotten in the Lincoln story. And of course, the Anderson River dumps into the Ohio just west of Troy. And Troy, in 1826, the Indiana Gazetteer reported Troy contained 19 families, 120 souls, 1 tavern, 1 store, 2 blacksmiths, a cabinet maker, 2 shoemakers, a physician, a 10-yard, a warehouse, and a post office. That's a major town. And my Illinois friends say Lincoln never knew a town until he moved to New Salem some 6 years later or so from this. But I beg to differ, because if you look at this and then look at what was at New Salem, it's very similar. Lincoln's time at Troy was an educational experience. He talked to these people who were traveling. He saw not only the people, but the newspapers from New Orleans to Pittsburgh, and was always asking questions. And he was introduced to the emerging market economy. Farmers began to produce surplus, especially hogs and hominy, or pork and corn. And there was a demand for these Midwest products in the South, and the cheapest transportation was the flatboat. So in 1828, this, by the way, is the George Honig illustration. Honig was an officer of the Southwestern group. Store owner James Gentry sent his son Allen, who was 21, and Lincoln, who was 19, to take his excess produce to New Orleans. Now remember, this is stuff that he accumulated over a period of time. It was worth a lot of money, and these 2 young men were going to be responsible for it. And it's a great responsibility, and they handled it well, I think. They had to guide the flatboat around sandbars, tree snags, eddies, a river crowded with steamboats. And that's a scary thought. You know, these things weren't very maneuverable, and you're going down the river, and all of a sudden the steamboat's bearing down on you. And then they had to guard against resist river pirates. And actually, the Lincoln and Gentry were attacked one night and had to fight their way free. They had to make the deals to sell the produce to the plantations along the way. And then they had to sell the remaining produce in New Orleans and sell the boat for lumber. And now they had to protect Gentry's money in New Orleans and on the steamboat back. And there obviously would have been a lot of people that would have been very happy to take the money from them. Plus, remember, New Orleans wasn't like anything they were familiar with. My friend Jim Madison from IU says this was Lincoln's spring break. He learned a lot about life by seeing life in New Orleans. If you want a complete account of this, I suggest you read the book Lincoln in New Orleans by Richard Campanella. Excellent book. Back to Bess Irvin. She sums up the Lincoln Inquiry work with, here in this new free state, the boy Abraham Lincoln grew to young manhood. His neighbors were largely clear-minded, unpretending men of common sense, whose patriotism was unquestionable. He was undoubtedly molded by their influence. Obviously, not the same image you get by some of those quotes I started with earlier. But what about lawyers?
Well, as I think most of us here on this presentation know, Abraham Lincoln rooted much of his persona in the law. It served as the center of his professional life and the platform for his political career. I myself, as a lawyer, am particularly interested in this aspect because of that. But I think because it was so much central to who Lincoln was, it's important. And there's a lot of debate among Lincoln historians as to how much Indiana influenced Lincoln the lawyer as compared to Illinois. I think the Historical Society helped uncover and bolster the claim that Indiana has a lot to say for itself in shaping Lincoln the lawyer and not just Lincoln the man. When Lincoln and his family eventually set out for Illinois in 1830, he left Indiana equipped with both exposure to educated lawyers and inspiration for the legal career before him. In several papers, the Indiana Lincoln Inquiry examined this issue, and they're in the book. The first Indiana Constitution created 1 Supreme Court and 3 circuit courts, with each circuit court assigned a traveling presiding judge. In January 1818, the legislature reorganized the state circuit courts by adding a new 4th circuit extending from the Wabash River to the Blue River, and included everything south of Gibson County to the Ohio River, and encompassing an area about 90 miles long and 45 miles wide. This circuit judge typically worked with associate or side judges elected in each county. In Lincoln's time in Indiana, All 8 counties of southwestern Indiana were the same judicial circuit for judges and attorneys. Often court would be in somebody's house or a rudimentary log house made for that purpose. Each circuit also had a prosecutor and elected sheriffs, and both were elected for their ability to call jurors and witnesses from the woods, from the door of the court building. Unfortunately, due to a courthouse fire in September 1833, almost all the early court records in Lincoln Spencer County are lost. But we do have records in Warwick and Perry County that remain, and the lawyers that were practicing there typically practiced in Spencer County as well. So we can know with some probability who Lincoln could have observed in his own county. One of them was Elbert Hayford. He was a Rockport native, a lawyer, and later the Maine auditor. And that provides an overview of the Lincoln environment, and Elbert Hayford, I should say, in his papers to the Historical Society, provide an overview of the legal environment during Lincoln's youth and his opportunities to learn the law. Now, Hayford walked through a long list of practicing lawyers and sitting judges during Lincoln's time in Indiana, including the lights of Daniel Grass, who was mentioned earlier. And Hayford's essay reads a little bit like a laundry list of prominent people, but for historians, I think it serves an important purpose for the Lincoln inquiry. It demonstrates that Lincoln's boyhood environment and the lawyers and jurists around him offered a fertile foundation for his future legal career. He had the opportunity to observe, interact with, and learn from educated and successful attorneys, a concept which seemed foreign to many in the larger national historical community, type of quotes we heard Bill reference earlier. There's 2 figures I want to highlight in particular that the Historical Society did a good job highlighting as well, and that is John Brackenridge and John Pitcher. They really stand out for their influence. Now, John Brackenridge was one of the foremost leading pioneer lawyers of Southern Indiana and provided an early legal influence on Lincoln. The Lincoln inquiry offered a biography of him from Eldora Minor Riley, whose mother was a sister-in-law to Brackenridge. Riley was a longtime teacher in Evansville, and in 1921, she was admitted to the Warwick County Bar. She became a leader in the local women's rights movement and was the first woman to serve on the Newburgh Town Board. I haven't researched this, and Bill may know this. I think she may have been one of the first women admitted to the bar in this area, or at least potentially in Warwick County. In this essay, Riley presents an overview of Brackenridge's ancestry, life, and family. He lived for a short time at Rockport and also at Boonville, and was prosecuting attorney of the circuit later in the 30s. There's an early history of Warwick County that described Brackenridge this way. Brackenridge was perhaps the ablest local attorney that ever practiced at the Warwick County Bar. Indeed, there were but few of his profession who equaled him in the state. His character was marked by strong individuality and fearless independence. He was outspoken in behalf of his own opinions, but maintained the secrets of his client's cause. He possessed a readiness of speech and a fund of resource that, combined with his quick perception, made him a strong and powerful advocate. His client's cause became his own, and no effort that promised success was too great for him to undertake. Now, I point that out because I think we can see many of those attributes in this quotation here that I think apply to Lincoln, and perhaps things that served as a model for him as he became a lawyer. Now, there's an oft-repeated legend that suggests Lincoln traveled about 15 miles to Boonville to hear Brackenridge speak in court, and noting in particular Brackenridge's defense in a murder trial in 1828, which allegedly inspired Lincoln to learn the law. According to Johnson, Brackenridge traveled to Washington, D.C. in 1862 to see Lincoln. The president, quote, instantly recognized him and said that murder trial formed a fixed determination to study the law and make that his profession. It was the best speech that I, Lincoln, up to that time ever heard. And if I could, as I then thought, make as good a speech as that my soul would be satisfied. So according to the legend, it was this speech in Boonville that really caused Lincoln to become a lawyer. And as a lawyer, that eventually caused him to become president and save the Union. You can see some references to this in Brackenridge's influence here on this plaque, which is standing today in downtown Boonville in Warwick County. Now, after Lincoln became famous, oops, I think I skipped the page. Nope, there you go. After Lincoln became famous, Brackenridge's family called a stump in the front yard Lincoln Stump because Lincoln allegedly perched there often to read. But later historians, most notably Lewis Warren, cast doubt on Brackenridge's influence, stating that no murder trials ever occurred at the time in Boonville. But, and this is important because we found this research in preparation for this book, Warren overlooked at least one important intent to murder case that did occur in Boonville at the time Lincoln was alive in the area and possibly could have been in Boonville at the time to see the murder trial. Miss Riley, however, supports the notion that Brackenridge influenced Lincoln and outlines important biographical information about the prominent attorney. So whether or not that Lincoln actually saw this murder case or not, there's no doubt that Brackenridge himself certainly influenced him. But our book, I think one of the important, interesting original research that you'll find in there is that there was in fact a murder case that occurred at the time that Lincoln could have heard, which is very different from the history that had been up to that point. Again, just to summarize, there had been this big legend around here that there was a big murder trial. National historians, driven largely by Warren, then said, no, that really didn't happen. Boonville wasn't that important to Lincoln the lawyer. Again, we were able to prove that there was a murder trial going on, but regardless of whether Lincoln saw that murder trial or not, it's no doubt that Brackenridge in some way, shape, or form influenced Lincoln, the lawyer. On to another, and the second influence I wanted to highlight, and that was Judge John Pitcher. Despite a number of public service titles that he held, and I listed some here: lawyer, sheriff, judge, postmaster, state representative, state senator, and candidate for U.S. Senate, he's often remembered mainly as the man who lent law books to Abraham Lincoln and helped inspire his legal career. The Commentaries on the Laws of England were one of them in particular. Lincoln's law books in Illinois was purchased, according to one historian, Albert Wildman, Lincoln's purchase of the books in Illinois was, quote, the event destined to shape his career and change the course of history. But in reality, he likely first read and became familiar with the Commentaries on the Laws of England here in Indiana, thanks to Judge John Pitcher. After Lincoln moved to Illinois, Pitcher continued to correspond with, quote, his friend Lincoln, and the two met in person at least twice. And then when Lincoln returned to Indiana in 1844 as a Henry Clay elector, he traveled to speak and canvass on behalf of Clay's presidential campaign. Lincoln wrote to Pitcher at the time to let him know when he would reach Rockport. Pitcher heard Lincoln deliver, quote, one of the best political speeches he ever listened to, and followed it with a speech of his own. So again, it's important to show just how close they were, that when Lincoln returned to give a speech in 1844, it was Pitcher who was one that he made sure to reach out to and talk with. In 1862, the two allegedly met again when Pitcher called on Lincoln at the White House. They may have also spoken about Pitcher's son, Thomas Pitcher, who participated in the defense of Harper's Ferry in 1862 and later served in the Virginia campaign. Notable here, just for the history geeks among us who are all on this presentation, Pitcher also mentored and trained Alvin Hovey, who lived in Posey County at the time, and Hovey later served as general during the Civil War, was an Indiana Supreme Court justice, a congressman, and the 21st governor of Indiana. Now, there's an explanation here that Hovey gives after he asked to borrow some books from Pitcher as a boy. He says, quote, I saw in his cold, clear gray eyes that he regarded me with no great favor and that he deemed my success as almost impossible. And I like how he describes this because it's the same type of reception Abraham Lincoln very well may have received when he as a boy asked Judge Pitcher for books as well. He gave me a long lecture about the impossibility of succeeding at the bar without immense labor and great talent, and asserted that every other calling, trade, or art afforded greater inducements. He read in my downcast, mortified look and trembling hands the anxiety I felt, and I could see that he felt for me. And his eyes seemed to say, I will give him a trial that will dispel his delusions. He arose and going to the shelves, handed me one of the oldest books of the profession. The backs had been torn off and corners turned down. I took it with thankfulness and retired. Such a great interaction. Maybe that's not how Lincoln felt when he did the same thing, but certainly it's an insight into how Judge Pitcher handled young people that wanted to study the law. And again, very well how Abraham Lincoln might have been met as he tried to study law here in Indiana as well. Pitcher's influence and instant interest also extended to politics as well as the law, so he may have influenced Lincoln on that front as well. While both served and lived in Indiana, Pitcher aligned with what would eventually become the Whigs, just as Lincoln later did. In 1836, Pitcher received the nomination for Congress as the Whig candidate, but lost to Democratic candidate Ratliff Boone, although Pitcher was later elected to state representative. Now, there's one other section in here that includes 5 essays that address the group, the Southwest Indiana Historical Society as a group, and their methods. Here you can see an image of George Honig, who, as Bill mentioned earlier, was a Spencer County native, who was a well-known Evansville artist and sculptor. His work is still evident today around the city. At the Coliseum in downtown Evansville, there is the Spirit of 1865, an image of the Civil War veterans on the left, and that represents victory for the Union. And then there is a companion piece on the right called the Spirit of 1916, which shows more reflective elderly veterans of the Civil War. George Honig was active in the inquiry and helped create the Lincoln Pioneer Village in Rockport, which I think still does a good job of honoring Honig and his work. But not all of the Lincoln inquiry's work gained wider acceptance. Their contemporaries often viewed oral history as suspect, and some historians even proposed banning the amateur historians from the field. In fact, much of the work did suffer from deficiencies, and I want to be very transparent and honest about those deficiencies. The group pushed a preconceived notion of Indiana, and they occasionally published family legends without documentation. Nevertheless, the Lincoln Inquiry's work remains important, and it's finally seeing increased attention. Here I have 2 books that give, I think, good attention to this work. On the left here, you see Everybody's History by Keith Erickson, and which does quite a bit to talk about the Lincoln Inquiry and their quest. For those members of the Historical Society who have not yet read that book, I highly recommend it as well. I think that book, along with ours, Abe Lincoln's, or Abe's Youth, I should say, really give a 1-2 punch for the Lincoln Inquiry, what they did, and the work that came out of it. In time, and I'm sorry, I should mention the other one here, Lincoln in American Memory from Merrill Peterson. The Historical Society doesn't get a whole lot of references in there, but it's enough to, I think, again, help solidify its importance among a lot of modern historians of Lincoln. In time, the Historical Society began to wane. By 1933, they dropped the annual meeting, and at least by 1939, it had ceased altogether. Now, their work can help us understand the environment of Lincoln's early life. But like we said, until now, a judicious collection of their most historically significant work has never been published. We hope that this volume, which is available through the Indiana Historical Society, Indiana University Press, will help preserve and extend their work and provide greater context for Lincoln's life in Indiana. As I mentioned, it was published by Indiana University Press, so you can see the work available through their website, but it's also available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all of your typical outlets to buy books. So with that, I guess we'll hand it back over.
Thank you, Josh and Bill. Again, you guys, I know when you said history geeks, I just smiled because I know you're talking to the choir, and it's so cool, especially Southwestern Indiana. The neat thing, you guys, please take some time and read Erickson's book because it's awesome. And then also Josh and Bill's book, which is awesome. But Josh and Bill, where did you guys come up with the cover? I've always wanted to know that. How'd you come up with this?
We did. It's the publisher who chose that.
Oh, you guys didn't do it.
Well, I think we may have submitted a few suggestions and ideas and let them pick from it. But, I will say, in my opinion, I think there's a strong deficiency of good artwork that depicts Lincoln's youth in Indiana.
Right.
I think sometimes he's either way too young or way too old. There's inaccuracies sometimes. So I will tell you, in time, I would like to improve that by, commissioning some artists to do a better job. But regardless, that picture was one that I felt at least did as well as a job as any that's currently available to, portray his youth in Indiana.
And also, if people who are listening have not been familiar, Southwestern did a artwork of Lincoln in Indiana. And Bill, thank you again for the help that you provided. But the pictures of Lincoln in Southwestern Indiana are very limited. And a lot of it is left to your imagination, which is, as you guys started your presentation with, a huge void in Lincoln's life is his Indiana years. So does anybody else have any other questions?
I just want to mention that
Thank you.
I'm in contact with the people at Fort Wayne from the Indiana Lincoln collection of possibly collecting a lot of those images and publishing a lot of the Indiana images and who the artists were and what they really portray. I don't know if anything is going to come of it or not. It's a very early stage, but maybe at some point, if I live long enough, we may have.
Thanks, Bill.
So I have I guess more of a comment than a question. I have to wonder if some of the disparaging comments about Indiana from Lincoln's youth is also connected to the name Hoosier. Because as I have discovered in a recent article that came out in Indiana Magazine, the historian Dunn, who's the one who's credited with Hoosier, meaning backwards, uneducated people, and he was taking that from a quote out of a newspaper, but had he bothered to check the newspaper he was quoting, the city and the county didn't even exist. There was a typo on the date. And that the actually earliest references go back to Cincinnati, and it's a boating term. But for years, that tag that Hoosier means, these backwoods people, stuck until the 2000s, before it was discovered that it was based off of, erroneous data. So I wonder if there's a connection there. It was easy to call Lincoln's neighbors, ruffians, because Indiana already had that reputation.
I think that's true, especially around 1900 or so, when many of these quotes are being written. But there's another part to that, and that is by historians and biographers making Lincoln's childhood very primitive and not having anything of merit for him to be inspired by, make him all that much greater. And that's that diamond on the dunghill idea. And so many of them wanted to downplay the area of his youth and the people he came in contact with, because that even made this man greater than if he would have been in contact with successful and inspiring people.
And it is also true, though, that Lincoln didn't have a lot of really nice things to say about Indiana either.
Well,
I know there's very little that he says about Indiana.
Well, he does say at one point, he talks, one person records that he remembers it in a very positive spirit. There's some poetry that some people interpret, but Lincoln becomes a very successful lawyer. He marries a very socially successful woman, and this whole background of his is an embarrassment to someone who is a successful attorney, until politicians keep telling him, no, You got to play that up because most people in the Midwest live like that. And so by playing up the fact that you split rails and you did the flatboat trip and you did all those things, politically, that's wise because people are going to identify with you rather than some of the other politicians at the time that had a very successful youth and were very well educated. So yes and no. I think he was embarrassed by it as a successful lawyer. But eventually I think he saw that there was certainly some merit to talking about that. And I think there was some affection for the people of Indiana.
Anybody else?
Fair enough.
Okay. Well, once again, Bill and Josh, I know these aren't the most ideal conditions, and Bill, we talked about this.
Yeah, this is Mark
Oh,
Browning.
Mark, yeah, sure. Go ahead, Mark.
Bill and Josh, I can't commend you enough for doing this. I think, as you stated in this, our formative years in most of our lives is in their age, 7 to 20, 21, like Lincoln had. But for you to describe this, I continue to think Lincoln is, like the right place, right time in the world. He had an inquisitive mind. And when you talk about that trail from Corydon to one of the highest population of brains in New Harmony in the United States, besides Philadelphia. And if he was inquisitive and he talked to those people, he got a lot out of that. I just can't thank you enough for doing this, because if you didn't do it, I don't know if it'd ever be documented the right way. He's just a hero in my mind forever. But the second question I have is, the Europeans would look upon Lincoln. My dad would always say they look upon him as, how could this hillbilly become the president of the United States? And they would look at him in a derogative fashion. Can you make some comments about what the Europeans thought about Lincoln?
Well, I think they really admired Lincoln. I mean, I don't know about contemporary, but more recent. He's one of the most admired Americans, and there are story after story of when Americans would go to Europe, the people want to know about Abraham Lincoln. People in Asia want to know about Abraham Lincoln. I don't know if it's still true or not. At one time I was told that Springfield was one of the most important sites to visit for people from Japan because of Abraham Lincoln. So I think they see Lincoln, if you look at the early presidents, they seem European. They experienced the same thing as the leaders of Europe. They had the same background and so forth. But Lincoln was uniquely American. And I think that's many Europeans saw Lincoln that way, that he wasn't just like their people, their leaders who were all well off, well educated, Lincolns and Jeffersons, Washington and Jeffersons and so forth. But if you really wanted to see an American, and you wanted to see what America was all about, you need to look to Abraham Lincoln.
Thank you. That's excellent. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Anybody else?
I do. I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Richard Sticky, and I'm figuring that all of you are from Indiana. I'm from Missouri, but I grew up in Illinois, and I have a great interest in Indiana, especially Lincoln history, because I wanted to give you just this brief background, because my wife's great-great-grandfather was David Turnham, and that got me interested in Indiana. But I do have a question about, you talked about how people down there influenced Lincoln to his legal career and his political career, like Breckinridge. There was a time when he worked on the river cutting wood. He worked for James Taylor. He took the flatboat down to New Orleans. And there was a time when allegedly he wanted William Wood to put in a good word for him to work on the river. What happened there?
Well, I think it shows, first of all, that Lincoln was ambitious. He was ambitious even when he lived here in Indiana. I don't know if Lincoln had stayed in Indiana, I don't know what he would have become, but I know he wouldn't have become a Spencer County farmer. I think he probably would have become either a businessman or a lawyer or a politician, probably, because from very early age, I think he saw that he had a different mindset, a different view of the world and his future than most of the people around him. And he was ambitious. Wood discouraged him. I don't think he was 21 yet, and so really he couldn't go off on his own until he was 21. But I think Wood discouraged that, and but you can see why the river was this exciting career. I mean, that the steamboats and the travel and all those things. You can see why a young, ambitious person would.
Especially if he could make $1 in a day.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Especially if he could make $1 in a day.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I got in trouble there too. And I didn't
Yeah.
include that.
Yeah.
But by taking people out to the steamers, he, at least the Dill brothers, who had the contract, the monopoly contract from Kentucky, since Ohio River belongs to Kentucky, to conduct the ferry on the Ohio River. Lincoln taking people out to the steamboat, the Dills thought he had violated their contract. And Lincoln said he only did that when the Dill brothers wouldn't come and get the people. And there are two versions. He's taken to court, Judge Pate's court in Kentucky. That house still stands, by the way. The only extant structure I know of that remains from that 1816 to 1830 period is the Pate House, which is in Kentucky. But there are two versions of that, if it's true, and some question it. One is that he tells Pate, I didn't know it was illegal. I didn't know anything, you know, I'm innocent because I just didn't know what was going on. The other one, which is more interesting, is that he actually argued the case. And he said, I didn't violate that monopoly. I only took him halfway. I didn't take him across the river. And therefore, I'm not guilty of violating. And whichever is true, Pate threw out the case. And some say this was Lincoln's first law case and he won it.
James Madison says that
That's awesome. Yeah.
out of IU. I mean,
The
he
problem
points
with
to
it
that
is,
as
and we're still
Lincoln's
trying to
first law
find this
case.
out. That story doesn't emerge until maybe the 1890s or so is the first time you really find. Now, supposedly the people in Kentucky knew about it, but you know, there are some people that question.
The earliest written record for that story is pretty late, which again doesn't mean it's not true, but it does make you can't say it happened for certain. But there's no doubt he got into a spat with the Dill brothers, and there's no doubt that it was handled, you know, in that court. It's just whether he argued it himself or not, I think, is up for debate.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard. Anybody else? And I'm going to have to agree with Mark, you guys. Thank you guys very much. I mean, as president of Southwestern Indiana Historical Society, what you did for our society, thank you so much. And also, thank you for agreeing to meet with us via Zoom. I know it's not the best conditions, but we certainly appreciate it.
I want to say one other thing, if I could.
Yeah, sure.
Josh
Bill.
has another book coming out soon with some reminiscences of Lincoln. You want to briefly mention that?
Well, yeah, it'll be published in January, and unfortunately, just after the Christmas holiday rush. But it will focus on J. Edward Murr, who was a circuit riding, I shouldn't say circuit riding, who was a Methodist minister in the area. He kind of came along a little before the Southwestern Indiana Historical Society's Lincoln Inquiry really got off out of the ground, and he was one of the early folks who really got to know, in part because he was a minister in the area, sort of these secondhand witnesses, and in some cases even firsthand witnesses to Lincoln's youth. And so he really spent a lot of time with them, got to know them, and in his own eyes knew those people better than anybody else, because when you look at the early Indiana historians for Lincoln, they kind of came, stuck around for a few days, got what they wanted, and bolted. Whereas he was here for weeks and months on end and really got to know them better. And so he viewed himself as one of the leading historians of Lincoln's youth. Now, like so many folks, he had his problems. He had his biases and his preconceived notions and the myths that he wanted to push. One of them being that the Lincolns first crossed the Ohio River closer to his boyhood home over in Louisville, which of course is not true. So there are, as with all history, there are questions about it. And I do the best job I can in correcting or noting those deficiencies, but it does provide another nice perspective that I think makes a really good companion piece to what we did in Abe's youth, of not necessarily original source material, but good secondhand source material for looking at Lincoln's youth in Indiana, because that's really been my goal for the last several years, is to build as much source material, whether it's first, second, or third hand source material as we can on Lincoln's youth, because we can never have too much of that. And eventually, Bill and I have a plan to someday put that into one big new comprehensive, nice Bible reference of Lincoln's youth in Indiana. But until we get there, we can at least build this source material as much as we can.
Thank you, Josh. Again, you guys, and I'm going back to what Mark said. If you guys didn't do it, how many other people are doing it? Madison, but Madison gives Southwestern Indiana you guys. So, Josh, thank you especially for your taking a step beyond. I know Bill's a fun guy to hang out with because he plants that seed and then pulls back and goes, okay, now go. And I see the smile on your face right now, Josh. And I can't wait for your new book will be out, you said?
January, yep.
In the first
and
year.
Again, I'm really just editing Murr's
right
source material, kind of like we did here. So providing footnotes to correct where it's wrong and contextualizing what he wrote when possible.
But don't say just, because again, what you guys did with this is just fantastic. It's a credit to our society. You guys, we should be very proud of our society and what we've done and what we portrayed Lincoln as. And also there's some great Hoyning statues or plaques of in Rockport. If you get a chance to go up there, it's just magic. So Bill and Josh, thank you so much. Anybody else? Any comments? Kathy, I see you're here. Are you there, Kathy? I see Kathy Bartelt in the bottom corner, Bill. You can't get the approval of your wife. So thank you all so much. We look forward to a wonderful year, and hopefully, as somebody started I think it was Beth that said, once this is all over, we can get together again. I think that's what we're looking forward to. So we have another year coming up, another 7 programs coming up next year. The board will get together in the next few months and we will put it out there, and we invite everybody to join us again. Hopefully we'll be at the Browning Room at Willard Library next year. And again, thank you all so much. Anybody else? This is the last meeting of the year. Thank you so much. Jennifer, you want to say something?
Thank you, Bill, Josh. That was just wonderful. Thank you.
Nan? Nan's muted.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Nan. Okay, you guys, thank you so much. I wish you all peace. Have a glorious summer, and we'll look forward to seeing you next year. Thanks, Bill and Josh. Bye.